All right, welcome to Bastyr Center for Natural Health. My name is Laura, and as Megan said, I'm a master's student in nutrition here at Bastyr. I'll be joined today by Ellie and Tessa in the green back there. We have some behind the scenes help here from Ryan, Emily, and Libby. And Autumn Hoverter is our clinic supervisor and an expert in gluten-free eating. So we're hoping to help you learn what gluten is and the spectrum of gluten intolerances, how to follow a gluten-free diet, and importantly, how to adapt to sustainable gluten-free living, including shopping and cooking strategies. But please feel free to ask questions at any time. And I'm going to start out with a question for you. So how many of you are not gluten-free but are considering it or wondering if it's the right thing for you? And how many of you are currently gluten-free? Okay. And is there anything in particular that you're hoping we'll address today, that you're hoping to get out of today? Some general information? Okay.
If it helps it all to be partly gluten-free, to cheat sometimes. I've heard it's like 100% or nothing.
Okay, and we'll touch on that. Okay. If I don't answer it, we can come back to it. Yeah.
Tips as far as understanding the hidden ingredients and then also cooking gluten-free, because obviously it's drastically different.
Yes, great, and we will be talking about that as well.
And my child, and
Oh,
you can
okay.
talk about children because it's my child.
Yeah. How old is your child?
He's 5.
And is he celiac or
No.
gluten-free? He
We
is gluten-free.
we just took one of the blood
Mhm.
tests and it showed a really strong reaction to all wheat products.
Okay. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
I'm vegan as well.
Okay.
I'm having a hard time managing both of those diets.
Interesting. Okay. So we'll be covering a lot of information. We won't be focusing particularly on vegan. That might be something to make an appointment with and have an individual consultation too as an option with the coupons. And that might also be beneficial too for your child. Yeah. Great. Thank you. So I think most of us know that food has 3 major components. There's the fat, the carbohydrate, and the protein. Gluten is just one particular type of protein that's found in wheat, rye, and barley. And we're learning more and more about how people can react to wheat and to that gluten. So what are the sort of spectrum of gluten disorders? So first there can be a wheat allergy. And so this is considered the classic or the true allergy, where you in response to eating the wheat, the body mounts an immune response against that, and is in the same family as like seasonal allergies, shellfish allergies, peanut allergies, and that's a very immediate response that can happen. In contrast, something like celiac disease, in response to eating the gluten, the body mounts this immune response that ends up damaging your own tissue. And there are some less common forms of this that we won't go into today, but can manifest as skin conditions. And finally, there's this large category of what we're calling now non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And it's not clearly defined yet what the mechanism is for that. It may or may not be autoimmune related. So when we look at the symptoms, as I mentioned before, with the wheat allergy, you're having this immediate response. This can be breathing difficulties, hives, some itchiness, and the extreme of anaphylaxis. Celiac disease is defined by that damage to the intestinal lining. So as the body responds and is damaging its own tissue, you lose some of your absorptive capacity. The non-celiac gluten sensitivity does not have that classic damage to the intestinal lining. However, they end up having almost identical symptoms with GI distress, pain, can be chronic fatigue, neurological problems. A lot of people describe kind of a mental fog that they're in. And the treatment for celiac and non-celiac gluten sensitivity would be the same of eliminating gluten from the diet for life. However, there can be a difference in the tolerance level. For the celiac disease, there's often almost no tolerance. You need to be looking for the cross-contamination, looking for hidden sources, and not getting any gluten in the diet. People with a non-celiac gluten sensitivity may or may not have a tolerance for small amounts of gluten. Whereas the wheat allergy is often specific to wheat, so those people may be able to still eat rye or barley.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Well, I don't understand you're saying non-celiac gluten sensitivity and celiac disease. Isn't that celiac? I mean, doesn't that mean the same thing, only less?
So the celiac disease is defined by that damage to the intestinal lining. So you can be having the same symptoms when they go in and do the endoscopy and take the biopsy. With one, they will see the damage to the lining and they'll be able to say this is celiac. With the other, they won't see that damage. But in both cases, by removing the gluten, the symptoms go away. And if you start eating them, they come back. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. So one of the questions we get is gluten-free diet just a fad? And I think for some people there is a fad element, especially as we start seeing all these gluten-free products. Maybe people that don't need to be gluten-free that are trying it to lose weight may or may not be successful. But we know that it is a real lifelong issue for millions of people in the United States. So the current estimate for celiac disease is about 3 million people and 17 million people with non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And most of these are not currently diagnosed. So if you know that you are somebody that needs to follow a gluten-free diet, how do you do that? So initially, it might seem somewhat straightforward if you just need to avoid barley, rye, and wheat. But we know that it can get very complicated very quickly. There are products that are made from wheat that go by different names, such as bulgur and couscous. There are relatives of wheat. The triticale is a wheat and rye hybrid. And some of these others are kind of the ancient forms of wheat, the einkorn, the emmer, and the kamut. And sometimes people ask if the ancient grains still have gluten. And it is true that some of the modern wheat hybrids have been selected for high levels of gluten, but the ancient wheat does still contain the gluten. All right, a question for you. So if you take any of these grains and you sprout it, does it still have gluten in it? Any guesses?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the gluten is part of that storage protein in the seed of the plant. And when you start to sprout it, it uses some of that up, but it is still in the seed itself. Okay, what if you continue to let it grow and you end up with wheatgrass? Does that wheatgrass contain gluten? So the wheatgrass itself does not contain gluten, but it can be very tricky to avoid the seed that can be contaminated into the wheatgrass, or if you've let it grow to the point that it's gone to seed. But that's why you might see something that is certified gluten-free that has wheatgrass as an ingredient. The grass itself does not contain gluten.
I saw at PCC they had bread. It was made by Sprout. And they said, oh, well, some people that are avoiding wheat can eat them.
Right, so spelt is a relative and it does still contain the gluten. Maybe for somebody that has a wheat allergy, that might work. For somebody that is gluten sensitive, that would not work. And then there's also the issue of contamination. There's non-certified, so oats themselves are gluten-free, but they're often contaminated. That can happen in the field. It can happen during the harvesting with the harvesting equipment. It can happen in the factory during the processing. So definitely look for certified gluten-free oats if you're somebody that needs to follow a gluten-free diet. Bulk bins can have contamination if they previously had gluten-containing items in there. There's other sources such as in the factory, restaurants using shared equipment, and Tessa will talk about how to avoid some of these sources later. And then there's all these hidden sources where you might not expect there to be gluten, but there is: sauces, dressings, stocks, mustard. All right, so the good news, though, is that most foods don't contain gluten, right? You can still have seafood and meat and dairy and eggs and vegetables and fruits, and there's all of these gluten-free grains as well. So we have amaranth, buckwheat, corn, millet, mantina, which is a type of Indian ryegrass, oats, quinoa, rice, sorghum, teff, and wild rice. So are there any of these that are unfamiliar to you?
Half.
About half, okay. So we have a few examples here of some of the different grains. Are there any in particular that you're unfamiliar with or would like to? The teff, okay. So we actually have an example of the teff, and it is a grain, an African grain. You may have had it if you've had Ethiopian food. It's made into the injera bread, that very delicious fermented flatbread.
But this is not ground up, it's just that.
Correct. So these are all the grains in their whole form, and they can all be ground into flour as well. Does anybody have experience with this mantina? You heard of it? Yeah. Autumn's shaking her head. We came across this and it ended up on the slide. I looked though to see where you could actually purchase it, and it looks like it maybe is no longer being grown. Yeah, it was developed by a university in Montana from a Native American Indian ryegrass and marketed, but I don't see it around anymore.
Can you explain the pseudo grains? What they mean?
Right. So a grain is technically the seed from a grass. And so the pseudo grains are a seed, but they're not from a grass. So just to be accurate, I put the little asterisks by the ones that are pseudo grains, but they're used in the same way.
They're still plants,
So
right? They're still plants,
Yes, they're just not a grass.
of grass.
Mhm.
So the ones with the asterisks don't have gluten, but they're.
Oh, okay. So these are all gluten-free, and we consider them grains. The three with the asterisks are technically pseudo grains. Okay. So they're still the seed of a plant, but they're not the seed of a grass plant. And so the jars are going around. You'll be able to look at them after, and we'll talk about them a little bit more in terms of how you might use them as well. And so as I said, these are all in their whole form, and so they can be used whole, and they can also be ground into a flour to use for baked goods. And these are some other gluten-free flours that are not grains. In the general categories of legumes, you may have seen garbanzo flour or fava bean flour. Those are two of the most common. I recently saw a black bean flour, although I haven't tried that myself. There's nut flours, like an almond flour or coconut flour might be ones that you've seen. And then also these tubers, which are the starchier flours. So how do you follow a gluten-free diet? Oh, it's a question, yeah. Yeah, so tapioca is here under one of the starchier tubers. Yeah. So unfortunately, a gluten-free diet does not always mean a healthy diet, especially with all the new gluten-free products that are available. They are often very refined. They may have lots of added sugars and fats. So it is common for people following a gluten-free diet to have deficiencies, particularly B vitamins, iron, and zinc. It's also common for the diet to be quite low in fiber, again from eating those refined grains. And the gluten-free flours that are refined are typically not enriched, meaning they don't have the nutrients added back in that have been lost during the processing, whereas the white wheat flour does at least typically have that enrichment with some of the vitamins added back after it's been refined. which is one of the reasons that nutrient deficiencies are more common with the gluten-free diet. So we definitely encourage focusing on the whole grains. And so there's a handout in your packet. I believe it's the 3rd page. And I just wanted to walk you through it because I think it has some good information. It can be a good reference for you. So you do often hear that one particular grain is a good source of protein or a good source of calcium. And so this is looking, what's that?
4th page.
Oh, 4th page, okay. It's the orange page. So you often hear that one particular grain is a good source. And so this handout is looking at equal amounts of different grains or flours and comparing them for protein, fiber, calcium, and iron. So it's looking at 50 grams. I did it by weight because if you take something and grind it up, it might not have the same volume, but it's going to be the same stuff. And so that's typically between about a 1/4 cup and a 1/2 cup. And on the, so for example, looking at protein, each box is 1 gram. The color changes for every set of 5. So for almond flour, for example, you can see there's 11 grams of protein and 10 grams of calcium, as you would expect from the nut. The other thing I wanted to point out on this is what happens when you refine something. So if you look at corn, you can see it has, so this would be using it in the whole form. Maybe you're using cornmeal, maybe making some polenta. You can see that it has 4 grams of protein, 6 grams of fiber, and 2 grams of iron. When you refine that into cornstarch, there is nothing left. That's not a mistake. It's played intentionally because all those values are 0.
What if you grind it up to be cornmeal?
Yes, then you would, yes,
You would still have
you would
it?
still have that. Yeah. Cornstarch is not something you would make in your own kitchen. You would be able to make it. Just taking out one particular part. So if you do want to experiment with some gluten-free baking, you will find that it works best using generally a combination of flours. And so we encourage using primarily the whole grain flours or the nut flours or the legume flours, and a smaller portion of those starchier flours. It will help you still get some of the results you're looking for, but have the nutrients in there as well. And Autumn shared her favorite baking mix. So of this 70%, sure I get this right, she does half brown rice and half sorghum. And of the 30%, she uses half potato starch and half tapioca flour.
What's that? What do you mean?
So so a lot of gluten-free baking goes by weight. I don't know if have you seen that at all? Okay. You could do it by measure or by weight. I think it's easier to calculate if you're using a kitchen scale. And so whatever your recipe calls for, or some people make up a big batch to have on hand.
Oh, to substitute for flour?
Right, to substitute for flour.
So what was those 2 again?
It was, so half brown rice and half sorghum flour for the majority of it, and then half potato starch and half tapioca for the 30%. Yes?
Is sweet brown rice different than brown rice?
It is a different strain, and it would say on the bag, yeah, if it was a sweet brown rice.
Thank you.
Do they bake differently? What happens when you start mixing these flours in the oven?
The gluten-free girl, or is anybody familiar with that blog? She does a lot of gluten-free baking, and I think is a good resource to look up and get some ideas on how to play with these flours. I think one of the opportunities of gluten-free baking is that you're going to be getting, you can try so many different things. Each one has a little bit different taste and texture. And so you can find out what you like. And I know some people really dislike the garbanzo flour, for example, and just never use that. Yeah, you're shaking your head. The coconut flour can tend to really suck up the moisture and can make it hard to bake. And you can see on that, once you look at the nutrients and in terms of the amount of fiber in the coconut flour, it makes sense why it might be a little trickier to bake with. So I think it's a matter of playing and experimenting, and Ellie will talk a little bit more about that when we get to the cooking demonstration as well.
So when you say the half brown, half sorghum, and the half clear, so what is that in a sense replacing? 1 cup of flour, or is that?
Right, so say you were going to make a batch of gluten-free flour mix, just to have on hand. 70% of that mix, and so see if you were doing it by weight, when I've done it myself, I used weight. So,
A lot of times you're wanting to replace like a regular recipe.
mhm. And there is more information on the Gluten-Free Girl website. If you're going by weight, it's 140 grams, replaces 1 cup of all-purpose flour. And so if you were making this mix up, I've done it before, you'd making, say, 1,000 grams at a time. And so I would do 700 grams of some mix of here and 300 grams of a mix from here. And mix that all together, and then I would just take out the portions I needed, yeah.
I just came in, so I haven't heard what you said prior, but I read this book, Wheat Belly, that made me some thought. And that doctor has everything on that right side of that list. He would put a big X through and say you should meet.
Okay.
Can you address that?
I'm not familiar with his reasons for that. These do tend to be lower in the nutrients, which we talked about on the slide previous. With baked goods, they do often give some lightness to it, which might be a reason to include it. If you're reacting to it, of course, don't use it.
I noticed you didn't mention supplementing that mix with either chia seeds or flax seeds or
Right.
gum or something.
Right. Those might come in more into the individual recipe rather than making up in your
It just might
batch.
not work if you tried to sort of if you just tried to substitute this for regular flour in a recipe. It might not work.
There would be, yes, there would be, so it would be something to experiment with, yeah. I know that, for example, the Gluten-Free Girl has gone away from using any of the gums. She herself reacts to it. I notice a little digestive upset sometimes when I use the gums, and so there's personal preferences.
So she also talks about how you can make a little paste from chia seeds.
So, right, chia or flax, yeah, can be added instead of the gums. Mm-hmm.
I was curious, when you have regular bread, I mean, when I go like to PCC and you can kind of like squeeze the bread soft and yummy looking, feeling, and then the flax bread is all like very unappetizing. And even to eat it, is very unappetizing. So is gluten the whole thing that makes it yummy?
I have had yummy gluten-free bread. We have some of our favorites listed. I think that's actually on the back of the orange sheet. My personal favorite is the Canyon Bakehouse 7-grain bread. It also is mostly a whole grain bread as well. And it's fairly squishy. Yeah.
So the gluten is just kind of like gluten.
Yeah, it gives it the elasticity, the chewiness. All right, so I'm going to hand it over to Tessa, and she has more shopping tips for you, and then Ellie will be doing the cooking demonstration.
All right, thank you, Laura.
Yeah.
Nice.
So, I'm going to talk a little bit just about kind of how to live with a gluten-free diet, how to shop and eat out and cook. And so if you guys have questions around that, this is going to be the time for that. And so I'm going to start with gluten-free grocery shopping. The first thing that you want to think about is, what are you trying to avoid? Are you trying to avoid all gluten or just wheat? And this is what Laura talked about at the beginning. And how strictly, if you have celiac disease, then you're going to have to be more strict about what you can buy at the grocery store, rather than if you're just have a wheat allergy or an intolerance, then you can look at the labels a little bit differently. I'm going to show you just an example of a regular food label. Yeah, so this is just a basic nutrition facts label, and I wanted to show you what you can look for. You want to always look straight to the ingredients, and if you're trying to avoid all gluten, then you're going to want to avoid the grains that Laura talked about at the beginning, which is going to be wheat, rye, barley, oats unless they're certified gluten-free. And then if you see the words malt or brewer's yeast, those are also going to contain gluten. But if you are just trying to avoid wheat, then it's a little bit easier because they have this allergen statement right here. And so this is required by the FDA to put on any FDA regulated product. And it'll say contains and it contains one of the top 8 allergens, which wheat is one of them. Then it's required to say contains wheat. So if that's what you're looking for, then you can always look to that, unless it's something that's not regulated by the FDA, like meat, but meat doesn't have gluten in it.
Well, a lot of bakery products don't have a nutrition label.
So if it doesn't have a label, then you can't use this technique. That's true. This is only for something that's packaged in the grocery store and that's already been regulated by the FDA. If it doesn't have a label, then you'll have to just look at the ingredients or ask for an ingredients list and look for the gluten-containing or wheat-containing grains.
Question.
Yeah.
So it'll never say contains gluten because gluten.
Right. It'll only say contains wheat. And so if you're looking more specifically for all gluten, then you can't necessarily use that trick.
And then you have to go by the ingredients.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see if I can get out of this now. Or do you have any more questions about the label? And I put a list of what I just said on your slide too. Okay, and then so if you are trying to strictly avoid gluten, they also have gluten-free certifications now. And there's these 4 different ones, are the main ones. And the most strict is this wheat crossed out, and this is by the Celiac Brew Association. And so what these are testing for is parts per million of gluten, and so they require that it has less than 5 parts per million of gluten in the product, which means basically 0, right? And the other ones are 10, which is also basically 0, so they're all really good. If you see any of these 4 certifications on a product, it means that they've been tested by a third party and they're inspected and regulated for really basically 0 gluten. And so these are what you want to look for if you have celiacs or you're looking to 100% avoid gluten. Yeah, so this one in the top corner, this is the gluten intolerance group, and you've seen a link to their website on some of the previous slides, and I'll show you that again. They have a lot of good information to help out with questions about gluten-free. And then these other 2, this is the Quality Assurance International, and this is called National Foundation for Celiac Awareness. And these 2 have recently combined, and so you might see either of these labels, but they work together now. So, any questions about the labels? Yeah, go ahead.
I understand that brewer's yeast contain gluten, but there's also a product out there that says gluten-free brewer's yeast.
Okay.
I'm assuming that's okay. It's made from something different than what normal brewer's yeast is made from.
Right. So if something says gluten-free, it might be kind of hard to know, and if you are needing to be strict about it, what I would do, if it has one of these labels on it, certified gluten-free, then that's okay. You can trust that. But if it just says gluten-free, you're not allowed to say that. But what I would do is call the manufacturer and ask what their process for certifying that gluten-free is, or how do they know it's gluten-free, or something like that.
Okay.
But if it has one of these labels, you can trust it. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, and then lastly, Laura mentioned this too, but just be careful with bulk bins because there are wheat-containing and gluten-containing products in the same area, and you never know which ones are going to get kind of mixed up a little bit. So, yeah, I have this. All right. So, eating out gluten-free. This is where I want a little bit of participation from you guys, because I know some of you have been following gluten-free diet already, and you probably have great ideas. I've noticed that a lot of restaurants in Seattle are very accommodating to the gluten-free lifestyle now, and so you can often ask for a gluten-free menu or ask what products do you have that are, or what dishes do you have that are gluten-free, and most places will be able to accommodate something. Again, the thing is, if you have celiacs or you need to have 100% gluten-free, eating out is difficult. And there are some of the bigger restaurant chains, such as Outback and Red Robin. They've actually gone through certification processes to have a gluten-free menu that you can trust. But they've only been able to do that because they're such big corporations. And so you could go to them. Those are 2 suggestions. Or some of the smaller restaurants, if you want to eat at those ones, then you can ask kind of how do they keep their... Basically what you want to do whenever you go out to eat is ask, you know. People aren't going to be afraid to share, and you should have confidence. I think I put on, don't be afraid to assert yourself. Like, ask how they prepare their products, ask what do they mean by gluten-free, you know, did they stir it in the same bowl that they just put flour in, or do they have a separate side of the kitchen for making gluten-free? So, I have a list on, if you guys find this page, it's on the back of the orange page, and it gives you some tips for dining out. So another thing is checking menus ahead of time. Almost all restaurants have their menu online, and you can look online and find what they serve, and so you can kind of have a plan for whether there's something there you can eat or not. And then telling the server when you get there, asking them for ingredients lists. And then on the right, I put different types of food, and the way that I compiled this handout, this eating out, shopping, and cooking handout, is I asked a few people that I know that have been following gluten-free lifestyle for a long time, and I asked, like, what is the best? Like, because these are tried and true. These are the places that people say these are the best restaurants, the easiest ones to eat at, the best. Oh, I forgot to mention these. If you go down to the middle one, shopping, the best products. So the bread is the one that Laura mentioned, Canyon's Bakehouse. And then I put on some other brands from pasta, crackers, and baking products that people have found. Those are the best ones to get at the grocery store. Because there's getting to be so many now. It's like this, and again, you can just try them all. But if you want to start with something that has been recommended,
You have other bread recommendations? I don't remember seeing that kind of.
Canyon's Bakehouse.
Essential is really good.
Essential now has a gluten-free, the Essential Bakery, they have a gluten-free line, and they package them all separately. So, and they sell those in the grocery store, right? Yeah, a lot of grocery stores have those.
Wheatless in Seattle is now Olivia,
Mm-hmm.
and that's pretty good.
Olivia?
The Olivia brand is actually like everything free. It's gluten-free, soy-free, corn-free, you name it, it's everything.
Allergen-free bread. All right.
Yes.
Olivia.
It's actually soft too.
What? Is it yummy?
Yes, the ones I've tried.
Gotta try that one. Okay, yeah.
Flying Apron Bakery?
Yeah, Flying Apron in Fremont is a bakery that they have all gluten-free. And they have a lot, they package a lot of theirs and sell them in other coffee shops and stuff too.
And I've discovered with hot dog and hamburger buns, they tend to be a bit dry, so put a little butter on them, grill them, and then they're good.
Yeah, toasting or grilling most gluten-free products makes them better. Heating yeah. So what about, I have a couple more minutes here. What about other restaurants that people have, where have you had good experiences of eating gluten-free? Tulio. What was it?
Tulio, yeah.
Tulio.
The Pink Door has gluten-free, and then on the east side, Coho and Evolution does not have gluten-free, but they guarantee wheat-free.
Okay.
What's Pink Door?
The Pink Door.
The Pink Door.
Pink Door.
Yeah.
Pink
Very
Door.
expensive. What was the other place?
There's a gluten-free restaurant in Redmond called Hugo's.
Hugo's.
They have really good food.
Okay, Hugo's in Redmond is all gluten-free. Wow.
Gluten-free beer.
Okay, good one. Any other ideas that you guys have had good experiences? Yeah?
What were the other ones?
Oh, the Pink Door, and what were the other ones?
Coho on the east side in Redmond. They have a gluten-free menu. And then in Bellevue Square is a restaurant called Evolution. It's just like the drinks. And they have vegan, and they also guarantee wheat-free, but they do not guarantee gluten-free. But if you look at their menu, you can clearly tell which is going to be gluten-free.
I noticed just up the street on 45th, the Olympic Pizza place advertises they make gluten-free pizza.
I've seen that too. Yeah, gluten-free pizza at Olympia on 45th. I haven't tried it, but.
Zaw also does a gluten-free crust.
Yeah, Zaw, you can buy the crust, yeah. Or they have the pre-made pizzas, then you bake them, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Trader Joe's also has a new gluten-free crust.
Oh, I didn't know that. Trader
It's
Joe's
a
has a
flat
gluten-free
bread.
crust. Okay, cool. Okay, so we're going to move on to cooking, and Ellie's actually going to share with us a lot of tips for cooking gluten-free, but I'm just going to point out a couple of cookbooks. Nourishing Meals, which Ellie has up here, was written by actually some Bastyr graduates, and yeah, she can pass that around. And they have a lot of suggestions for a lot of different allergies, but I think, is everything in there gluten-free? Or do they have, I think it is.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I think everything in that book is gluten-free, and there's really good recipes. And then this other one, someone was asking about baking earlier. So this gluten-free baking guide, or the essential guide to gluten-free baking, that's what it's called. And they go through each flour. They're actually Bastyr graduates, or at least one of them is. And they go through each flour and describe like all the properties of it and the things that it's good for baking, and they have a really detailed description in there. So if you're interested in baking, I would highly recommend this gluten-free baking guide. There's 2 parts to it. And then finally, Gluten-Free Girl is the other one that Laura was mentioning, and this is her cookbook, and she has a blog and she has an app. And lastly, I just forgot that I had another. If you guys are into smartphones, Find Me Gluten-Free is a good app you can download, and it can help you find gluten-free restaurants in Seattle. So, all right, on to cooking made easy with Ellie.
Right. Well, again, my name is Ellie Freeman, and I absolutely love to experiment with gluten-free foods in the kitchen. And I, too, follow a gluten-free diet. So I wanted to share with you some tips that I have and tricks that I've learned along the way, and I'm also going to let you taste it. So what I want to do is make everything really practical. Everything that they just talked about, we're going to put it to use really simply here. And I also want to answer any more questions of yours that relate specifically to gluten-free cooking and baking. But I also want to just emphasize that gluten-free cooking and baking, your options aren't limited. What we're trying to do here is send you away feeling empowered, feeling like there are a ton of options. You're looking up front here at the different grains and seeing that you have a lot more options than you thought. The important thing actually is just to keep in mind your ratios. So what Laura was saying before about the 70 to 30 ratio, that's something to keep in mind as you enter the kitchen, as well as which grains are gluten-free, so that you aren't looking for gluten on labels or of your baking products, but more the grain that the gluten has. So, does anyone, before I start, just to make sure I cover my bases, does anyone have any questions particular to cooking or baking before I begin? All right, well, if any do come up as I am talking through the different, I'm actually going to walk you through 4 different recipes, and if any come up, feel free to jump in. So with your packet, go to the last page and look at the front of it, and you'll see buckwheat spice pancakes. We didn't make that for taste testing today, but I did want to point out something that we covered, and that is the 70 to 30 mixture. So the 70% is coming whole grain, is coming from your buckwheat flour. You'll see that's the first ingredient in the pancakes. And then the 30% starch is coming from your potatoes. So that's something that we just practically gets put into use with these pancakes, and it'd be awesome to go home and try these out. We just thought cold pancakes wouldn't be quite as good as maybe some black bean cake and some protein bars that we're gonna taste test. So does anything else on this list look unfamiliar?
What if you have buckwheat and it's like in little pieces, like groats or something?
Yeah.
And they're bigger, and they look like they're kind of hard before you cook them. Can those be ground down on your coffee grinder?
Absolutely. Yep, there's actually some buckwheat groats right behind you. And what I'd suggest is just throwing those in. If you have a really good blender, you can blend whole grain groats into flour, and then you have the whole grain oats. So, yep, I'm pretty sure that's actually what is intention by this. You can just grab the oats and the buckwheats themselves and throw them in the blender. So, good question.
Is there a reason why the 70% isn't that all and the 30% is another one?
Well, the 70% are grains that are whole grain, and then the 30% are starches. So it's a little bit more protein and fiber coming from the whole grains, and a little bit more starch and coming from that 30%. So people have just found, again, you want to reference a good cookbook or website for a good blend, and you can experiment once you know that ratio. But I think that's a really good.
Do you need the starch in order to do something in the cooking process?
The starch is going to give it a little bit more lightness. It's going to keep it so that it's not as dense. Because if you're just going to throw in one flour, just plain almond flour, just coconut flour, that can sometimes fall in its face because it's just a little bit too dense. So anyway, play around with it, but I've definitely played, and that got me into trouble with just using one flour that's just whole grain. So.
Does that work instead of the gums that they say people don't like to use the gum?
The gum, using the starch instead of the gum?
Yeah.
No, the starch is not necessarily the thing holding it together. It's just giving it a little more fluff. That might be what's giving the bread the squishiness that you like.
So what are you using the gum for? Is that what you're asking?
Oh,
Binder.
yeah, the gum is going to be a binder and just hold it together a bit better. But the starch is going to give it a little bit more lightness to it.
Okay.
Good question.
Can I ask you what the coconut palm sugar is?
Yeah, that's just a different variety of sugar. So feel free, I actually am glad you asked that because you can use different types of sugar. There's date sugar, coconut sugar. It's just a fun way to play with it. I think in the next recipe, when I talk about the banana protein bars, there's another ingredient like that you might not recognize. Okay. Great, so the next recipe I want to talk you through is something that can be used for breakfast. So just flip back one sheet, just flip your packet right over and you'll see banana bread protein bars. And again, you have your raw buckwheat groats ground into flour. Then you have your gluten-free rolled oats, so those are 2 grains that we overviewed. And then going down into the wet ingredients, look at the coconut nectar syrup, and that's something that is just has a lower glycemic index, but it's definitely something you can substitute. In fact, we did use honey instead. So if you like the taste of these, scribble it out and put honey, or even brown rice syrup. It's just fun ways. Again, experimental cooking is really fun. Okay. So this is what it's going to look like when you pop it out of the oven. And in a few minutes, you're going to taste it. So we are gonna chop that up and give you all samples of that. Okay, the next option that I wanted to overview before I walk you through our quinoa is black bean chocolate cake. So go to the very last page. And this one is super fun because you're using whole black beans. You haven't even ground it into flour. You're using cans of beans to create the texture and the moisture that comes from this black bean cake. So that's another really fun option right here. And of course you have just some cocoa powder. There's no grains that's been ground up, nothing. I mean, most of the density is coming actually from the eggs. And a light sweetness from the applesauce. So this is what it looks like when you pop it out of the oven.
Is that fresh strawberry? I mean, fresh
Then you put the strawberries on.
And then we put the strawberries on, of course.
And the powdered sugar.
Good call.
Yeah.
Just to make it pretty. Presentation is everything, right? Okay.
So regular oats have gluten in them, and you've got to make sure you have gluten-free oats.
Well, the oat itself doesn't, but there's cross-contamination.
Okay.
So you just want to make sure that if you are very sensitive to gluten, that you're getting it in a package and not in the bulk aisle, because they're very easily contaminated. All right, let's check out the Mediterranean quinoa. So flip to that recipe because I'm going to walk you through, because I really wanted to show you how simple gluten-free cooking can be. Okay. So now I'm highlighting one of the grains that we really touched on, and it's quinoa. Is anyone unfamiliar with quinoa? Okay, good. I feel like it's kind of become a staple, which makes me really happy because this is an awesome grain. It's really high in protein, gluten-free, so you can just really satisfy a lot of palates with this grain. But to spice it up, I'm going to put together a little vinaigrette. So I'm going to start with, this is just olive oil and lemon juice. And Simple as that. It's just a half a cup of each, and that's gonna be our base to our vinaigrette. The herbs that I'm gonna use are some chopped parsley. This is just flat leaf Italian parsley, and it's in season right now, so it's so delicious. I'm gonna stick that in there. And the next is some fresh mint. Again, this is gonna give it a lot of sweetness and flavor. So I'm gonna put that in there. And next is pine nuts, and this is another one that you can substitute a lot of things for. I actually usually make this recipe with pumpkin seeds, and it's just as good and actually a little bit less expensive. So that might be something to take into consideration. And I just lightly toasted these this morning. Actually, you just, when they start becoming aromatic and you just can smell them out, you know it's toasted. So it gives it a little bit boost of flavor. I'm gonna throw that in at the end, as well as some scallions. Another name for it is green onions. Yeah?
If you sprout your seeds, then can you bring in and toast them a little bit? Or not?
Yeah, you know, if you're strictly following a raw diet, then it's no longer raw. But as long as you're fine with it not being raw anymore, of course. Yeah, that's a great idea.
What was the question?
When you toast it, is it okay to toast sprouted seeds? So,
okay.
Yeah, once you sprout your seeds, because you can sprout seeds and nuts, and yep, that's absolutely fine. You might lose just a little bit of the enzymes in that live sprout, but it's absolutely fine, and it's great that you sprout your seeds. So that's the next one, and then this is, again, another, I'm just showing again and again how many substitutions you can make. You have so much freedom in the kitchen, but this is I think a half a cup of currants. I'm doubling the recipe, but I actually am substituting cranberries, so you can let me know how this tastes today. And last but not least, I just have some feta. And this, if you're dairy-free, lactose intolerant, you can always leave this out. I do it a lot, and it's just as good. So I'm gonna pour all of this into my quinoa. And I want to make a special note about quinoa, and that is that every time you use it, you always want to rinse it off. Does anyone know why rinsing is important? All right, well, quinoa, if it's unrinsed, it has something called saponins on it, which make it pretty bitter, and you want to wash that off. So anytime you get your raw quinoa in a jar, throw it, just give it a quick spritz, and before you throw it in the water to boil, and that'll make sure that you don't get that bitter aftertaste.
Are some of the packaged quinoas, like in Australia, Joe's packaged one, are they pre-rinsed or like what it say? Or?
You know, I've never seen one that has said that.
Yeah, some of them do. Some of them do say pre-washed on the front of the package.
Oh, good call. Yeah, you know, I'm used to buying it in bulk, so I haven't seen. And I assume in bulk it's not pre-rinsed, but just something to keep in mind. Yeah.
It couldn't hurt to give it another rinse.
It couldn't hurt, and it's super easy because you're throwing it in the water anyway, so it's not a big deal. So.
Sorry to interrupt. Does anyone have a Honda Elantra in this room? Okay. This is gonna get towed. Great. Thank you.
Okay. So essentially all of that.
You could put nuts in it, right? Like walnuts or something?
Yeah, absolutely. This is just a very classic Mediterranean dish. You know, you'd probably see this with an orzo or a couscous. And so substituting the quinoa for that grain is an easy substitution. And depending on how long you simmer your quinoa, you can give it the same type of texture. So I'm giving you guys a medium texture today. I kind of took it off at about 10 minutes after it was simmering. And it still is, it could have gone longer, but you know, I can't please everyone, so you can always do it yourself too.
You can't?
I try, I really do, but I found in the culinary world, everyone has very particular palates too, so you can, that's another benefit to cooking on your own too. You can just play with it. Okay, and last but not least, I'm gonna put all the feta in. And
did you say that you could substitute quinoa for orzo or couscous?
you can, but again, orzo and couscous are glutinous. They have gluten in them. So I'm saying if you had a recipe that had, yep, yeah. So it's a very versatile grain. And you'll see this just has so much color to it, and it may have looked like a lot of herbs that I put in, but that's what's giving it so much flavor. So.
Okay, I'm gonna make a quick note about the food that they're passing out. So we made this in our own kitchens, and we all have cooked gluten in our kitchens before. So we didn't use dishes that had gluten on them. They were all clean, but just if you are celiac or being very strict, then you might not want to have the baked goods.
And last but not least, I think it's always nice to put a little bit of salt on and it brings out the flavor of your food. And this is just some pink Himalayan sea salt, and that's basically it. So all the other time that was spent on this was just me cooking the quinoa, pre-cooking it, and chopping the vegetables. But you can see that it's really not, it doesn't take more time to be a gluten-free cook.